Next amendment. Dr. Burgess.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendments at the desk. The amendment will be considered as read without objection, and the gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes to speak in favor of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. Had the last amendment passed, this amendment would not have been necessary. This is a much more modest attempt to fix the projected 20% decrease in physician reimbursement that's going to happen in less than a year's time. So this amendment would stop the cuts coming in January 2010 and set a payment update of 2.7%, following the advice of the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, and then it would set the 2011 Medicare physician payment update based on the MedPAC recommendation formula of increases to produce an update equal to the Medicare Economic Index. And very importantly, Medicare beneficiaries would be protected from having their Medicare Part B premiums increased, even though the amendment will protect physician payments from decreases for 2 years. And I want my colleagues to know that all this does really is stop the decreases in payments to physicians for 2 years and ensure the beneficiaries will not be penalized by losing physician services, and it means the physicians will be treated fairly, and that a cut which was unintended and which was a result of a mistake by the Congress will be avoided. These increases are coming as a result of the flaws in the Medicare formula created by Congress, and it is agreed by everyone who has looked at this that these increases, rather these decreases, are in fact a result of a mistake by Congress which has not yet been corrected. Now, I want you to listen to what your doctors at home are saying, and I do want to yield time to the ranking member of the full committee. If members recognize the substance of this amendment, I would just point out this amendment was offered by Mr. Dingell in 2005 to the Deficit Reduction Act, and 22 Democrats voted in favor of this amendment. I'll yield to the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you for yielding, Dr. Burgess. I rise in very strong support of this amendment. This is the exact language that former Chairman Dingell offered when he was the ranking member during the Deficit Reduction Act debate several years ago. We had a lengthy debate at that time. 22 current members of this committee on the Democrat side voted for it, including Mr. Waxman, Mr. Dingell, and Mr. Pallone, who all strongly supported it in addition to voting for it. Again, this is the exact language of the Dingell amendment offered in this very same committee approximately 3 years ago. I strongly support the passage. I thank the gentleman for offering the amendment, and I would point out, Mr. Chairman, that when we have had a debate about PAYGO, the new majority in this Congress eliminated the PAYGO requirement, and there is no PAYGO language in the underlying print, and I'm told there will be no PAYGO on the bill that goes to the floor next week. So I urge support of the Burgess amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Let me just inform the clerk that the wrong amendment was distributed, and perhaps we can distribute this one, but I think the members are fairly familiar now with the intent of the amendment and what it would do. Chair recognizes himself in opposition to this amendment, not because I oppose the amendment. Certainly I support it, and I believe that when it had been offered at previous times, I voted for it. We must address the Medicare physician payment formula. I'm fully committed to doing so. We know that we're looking at an expiration of the current protections for physicians' payments in January 2010, so we have to address it. But this is not the vehicle or the right place for fixing the Medicare physician payments, and making payments in Medicare contingent on subsequent actions by Congress is a dangerous precedent. We have an opportunity to make a major investment in this nation's health infrastructure in this bill. We can't let that be derailed by other problems in Medicare, as serious as they are. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So I am very reluctant, because I support what the gentleman's trying to do, but I'm reluctant to reluctantly must oppose it and urge members to vote this amendment down so we can address it at some other time. Mr. Pallone, do you want to add anything more?
Well, just again, I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, obviously we want to address this, and we intend to, with, hearings and attention to it over the rest of the year. But again, the health portions of this stimulus package are carefully tailored to deal with the immediate problems, and those are, people that don't have health insurance, the states that need to cover Medicaid patients because the lack of health insurance for people who are unemployed. And, most of the money in this bill goes for those purposes, which are immediate needs. And this is something that we have time to address and is not the immediate need at the level of FMAP and COBRA and the other problems of the uninsured that are in this bill. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. I yield back the balance of my time. All time has expired. We'll have a roll call vote on this amendment, and we'd like to ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Upton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Ms. Bono-Mack. Ms. Bono-Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Other members. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Dingell votes no.
There are members on the other side.
Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich votes aye.
Have all members responded to the vote? If so, the clerk would tally the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 15 and the nays were 34.
15 ayes, 34 noes. The amendment's not agreed to.